I do want to kind of lay the groundwork for why we're having kind of this three-part webinar series or session called the Scholarship Operations Masterclass. And last week, or maybe it was the week before, we actually hosted a webinar. We do, 6 to 8 webinars per month, largely education and resource driven. We're very fortunate. We'll kind of get into our introduction to work with thousands of scholarship programs, grants, awards, you name it, every single year. And so with that, we like to pretend that we know what we're doing. We've heard a lot of great success stories and also seen, some of the things that may not be working with organizations. And our goal is to kind of translate and share some of these insights and best practices and trends with you guys as an audience, with or without reviewer. That way you can leverage them and kind of, equip your programs for success. The webinar that we had hosted last week was largely around AI. So the entire concept was, what are kind of 3 ways that AI is being used to empower and drive the review and selection process of a scholarship? And in that conversation, we started to learn very quickly that scholarships need to be thought from like a chain link perspective. That every single stage or every single element of a scholarship directly impacts the next piece to it. And so, even using some of these AI tools and some of the best practices that we offered, we had found that for many organizations, they didn't have like the framework or the groundwork in place to even leverage them or have success from it. So that's kind of what led us to have, this kind of webinar series and topic. Again, I'll kind of get into our introduction, but the Scholarship Operations Masterclass broke into 3 very important, distinct concepts that go into scholarship ops. And when I use the term operations, we're not going to talk a lot about admin stuff. Really comes down to like the 3 phases of a scholarship: the applicant experience, so the online submission process, what type of data we're collecting from them, how do we kind of put our programs into a position for success, and from like a chain link perspective. If we don't knock the first phase, the applicant process, out of the park, it has a trickle down effect on everything else. The next session that we'll kind of look at, and I'm going to come back to this, will be the review and scoring and selection piece to it. And then the third piece, which is incredibly important, is the ongoing relationship with scholars. And that's a pretty adaptive conversation around, renewable scholarships, getting testimonials, impact reports, success stories, and things like that. But again, you can't jump to session 3 without kind of going through session 1 first, because what we're talking about today really does lay the groundwork for absolutely everything. And I do believe that for most organizations that kind of run scholarships, grants, awards, that list goes on, is that a lot of times we look at these programs from an admin perspective, right? How do we create efficiencies and structure to make our own lives easier, which is certainly valid. But at the end of the day, you make up a third, if not less, of the program. The applicants and the people who are applying make up a large percentage of it. And then as do your volunteers and your review committees and your scoring team. And so how do we kind of take a slightly less of an emphasis off of us? And as a byproduct of elevating their experience, we also create efficiencies for you guys. So just really briefly, again, Reviewer started back in about 2011, early 2012. What makes us rather unique and why we named the company Reviewer is that's the background that we had. So we actually serve from a pure volunteer capacity as part of judging, scoring, and selection committees for funding opportunities. And there was a time, if you can believe it or not, that these were all done through paper. So we'd have physical binders mailed to our doorstep, tasked with handwriting notes and comments and scores and shipping it back. And as you can imagine, it was not terribly efficient. What I'll tell you, though, is that as organizations try to go online, which was a combination of built-in web forms, emails, spreadsheets, downloading of documents, that actually was a slightly more negative experience for us. Because at least with the paper and the binder concepts, while very heavy and very manual, it was all consolidated. Now, again, operationally getting those binders to us, I'm sure was an absolute administrative nightmare. But by the time we got involved, it was nicely packaged up. With the online process, so forms, emails, spreadsheets, downloading of documents, we probably spent 4x the time from a pure volunteer perspective. And we started to see some of these negative ramifications. So lost information, a lack of data redaction, biases bleeding into the selections. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for us, that said, look, as a mission-driven organization and as a volunteer, if we're going to run these programs, let's do so the right way. Let's make sure that the applicants get the fair opportunity that they deserve. Let's make sure we're funding the right people. Let's make sure that we get the success stories from the scholars that we're awarding, that equips us as donors and admins to kind of secure additional funds or retain our current donors. And those are the things that weren't happening. So we built Reviewers, an online platform to really run the entire life cycle from literally application and open all the way through post-selection of scholars. And so again, the goal here today, and then we'll kind of look at like what the next couple parts look like, is to really focus on the front end. So it's building a very engaging and adaptive applicant experience that does two very important things. It captures the data that you need from a scholar because ultimately you need that for judging, scoring, and selections, but doing so in the most low barrier way as humanly possible for these busy people. A lot of organizations will come to us and say that they struggle with participation rates or they have incomplete submissions. And we don't feel that's the fault of an applicant. We feel that's a structure issue that we have going on. So again, I think it's really important that while today's conversation is one that people often overlook, it's just an online form, we're just collecting scholarship applications, it's not that important. It really is, right? Because again, it's like a chain link. And if any of these chains in the overarching process breaks, it'll directly impact every stage there on after. And so it really comes down to blocking and tackling, systematically go step by step through the entire scholarship process and doing it the right way to put us into a future position for success. So on the applicant front of things, what are some of the things that we're seeing right now across Reviewer? Without using our tool set and some of the data that we've done, we're finding there's about a 29% attrition rate, right? There's a large number of individuals who start applications or they attempt to apply to a program. And for whatever reason, either complexity of the forms, technical issues, they forget about dates and deadlines, they drop off and they never apply. That's a problem, right? Because at the end of the day, we're mission-driven organizations. We want to see high volume because the higher the volume, the more impact that we're going to potentially have. Understanding that not every applicant gets awarded, but the larger the pool, especially the larger the quality pool becomes, the more impact that we're ultimately going to have. So what are some of these challenges we have to address is the barrier to apply, right? It's 2026. Depending on the demographic of your organization who's applying for it, these are individuals that are expecting a very clean, very modern, mobile responsive online experience. They don't want to be filling out PDFs and Word docs and emailing it back to you. They don't want to go to a generic online web form that times out midway through and makes them repeat their process, right? So those are some of the things that we'll look at. The other thing we want to look at is your bandwidth. So for a large number of organizations, they have very clear cut eligibility criteria, requirements, deliverables that they need from an applicant. And not only are they, but also their review team spending a lot of time just sifting through and vetting through applicants in a phase one process just to ensure that A, they're eligible, and B, they have all the information that they need to begin judging and scoring. And in the case that they may not, it's the back and forth with the applicants to get the information from them, getting them to submit the required deliverables, et cetera. Or if they're not eligible, having those very tough conversations of, hey, we just wasted an hour of your time applying when in reality that you never even should have got in there in the first place. I do want to spend a fair amount of time today talking about letters of recommendation. It's a growing trend across probably 95% of the scholarships powered by Reviewer. And there's a pretty large fundamental shift happening with how references are being collected, a shift away from reference letters and more of a move to a template or like an essay-driven reference model collected directly from the references themselves. And then the third thing, which I just talked about, is the chain link effect. And to kind of set the stage for that, that's the first piece that we're going to talk about, is it's a mental shift away from how we collect applications from, hey, these are scholarship applications to these are scholar profiles. And that mindset of having a comprehensive profile per scholar is really what unlocks sessions 2 and 3, which is the built-in judging and scoring, as well as like the ongoing data collection and relationships with your scholars themselves. So with all that said, I know a long-winded introduction, but I think it is very important there to kind of talk through the importance of today's conversation because it is a big mental shift away from just online forms to really creating a fundamental structure from an applicant's perspective. And so I'm going to skip through. I already kind of addressed these 5 things that kind of shape the program. The one thing I didn't talk about was number 5 here, which is really program design. Scholarships of all shapes and sizes have different emphasis and different focuses, right? Your scholarships and what you're collecting from the applicants has to align with the mission and vision of your organization. We have some clients that are completely financial need based, right? So it's very household income driven, it's budget driven. Others are completely academic driven, some are essay driven. And so it's all about how do we design a scholarship process that gives you guys a comprehensive picture of each applicant, giving them the voice that they need to differentiate themselves from their peers who are also applying in a very competitive space, but also collecting the proper data that aligns with your mission and vision to ensure that you're funding the individuals, right, that are best fit for your organization. So we'll inject that throughout the entire conversation today. So the first thing that we want to look at here is it's not just an online form. I just talked about this. It really is an applicant profile. There are so many moving parts to scholarship operations. You've got the scholars themselves, you have their application forms, you have their file uploads, you've got communication back and forth. Ideally, there's a structured judging and scoring process, which is what we'll talk about next week, and then the ongoing deliverables from the scholars. And so it's really essential to kind of, again, take this process and put them into a profile that encompasses and holds on to all the data relevant to them. It also unlocks the proper experience, like the ability to save and log out and come back later. So again, kind of picture two different worlds. And I don't know if you guys want to toss it into the chat, and you guys can leave any questions you want, what your current processes look like. A large number of organizations, when they think through, hey, let's run an online scholarship, the first thing they do is they spin up an online web form, and they think that that's like the number one piece that goes into this. So they have a long, lengthy form, has all the file uploads in there. They can come back later. They start to fill it out. The downside with that is what happens next. So with any of these online form tools, JotForm, SurveyMonkey, that list goes on and on. What you're really doing is having just a one-dimensional data collection process, right? People go to the form, they fill it out. We hope that they don't save or time out and lose their information. There's no way for them to save, log out, come back later. There's no way for them to trigger things like references. There's no way for you guys to track progress. So that 29% of people who start but never finish, how do we catch them very early on and send them reminder messages? So these are all things that we can't accomplish in a normal online form. And then you start to couple that with like the negative impact of it. So again, we want to think about this from a profile first process where applicants build a comprehensive profile. Depending on your scholarships, if you offer multiple of them, or if it's a multi-year program with like renewals, we don't want to be asking scholars to come back and, submit their name and their email every year, because, that doesn't change. What we really want is, what's new about their profile. So having like a comprehensive snapshot of the scholar that continues to grow and grow. And then again, some of the things that we don't often think about. So mobile responsive right now, depending on your location, right? If you're in Africa, over 95% of people applying for scholarships do so on a mobile device. But at least here in the States with Reviewer, over 60% of applicants will start this process on a mobile device. And so how do we make sure that if we know they're going to use mobile, that it's not only mobile friendly, but also ADA compliant? How do we potentially capture data in a multi-stage environment? For some of you guys who might be collecting very complex information, social security numbers, tax returns, FAFSA, do you need to collect that from everybody, or do you only collect those from those that advance to like the next phases of the process? So again, with a one-dimensional form, you can't quite accomplish some of those things. So instead of just reading off of a list and letting you guys kind of look at my screen, I want to show you practically what that would look like. And so we're going to go through a couple different pieces here. I'm going to introduce that concept of a profile, and then the critical piece to this will be the eligibility checks, which is the next topic that we're going to look at. So in Reviewer, ideally speaking, you guys use your main websites, right? From a content perspective and a marketing perspective, you want to have a centralized hub that has all the information about your program. And you want to leverage the brand that you've built. You don't want to have microsites or landing pages or a bunch of standalone forms for these different programs. You want a centralized hub that you link off to that kind of collects everything in one spot. So I mentioned before, like the concept of a profile, it's intended to grow. So the first pass of a profile obviously is your submission form and your file uploads, but over time, that profile holds on to who they are, their forms, their files, communication, judging and scoring, and any ongoing deliverables, parent forms, acceptance packets, renewables, fund disbursement forms, thank you letters, whatever that might be. So in Reviewer, that is like the critical first piece. Is the applicants come in, they create their profile, and then that drops them into the first step of the application. I will come back to this because I do want to run through like a proper application design. And again, none of these are like terribly complex topics, but incrementally they add up to be the proper experience that we're looking for. And so again, for example, the saving and logging out. So if one of our main goals is looking at participation rates and looking at dropouts, a large number of scholars want to look at your forms, they want to see what's being collected from them, and then they want to leave. They want to go work offline, they want to come back later, they want to work at their own pace, and then when they're ready, they want to fully submit. The challenge with that is we've got no idea who they are or where they're at within this journey. And so to kind of hop around a little bit, from a pure operations perspective, you'll get these built-in command centers. And the entire goal here is not only to track dates and deadlines, recent activity, but visually show you where are people in the grand scheme of things. And so on the very front end, we can actually show you in real time right away who has started an application, if they finished or not. And then for those, the 29% that haven't finished, who are they? How far have they made it? And then send them reminder messages. And it can be individual one-on-one reminders. You can create like email templates and automate them with like a sequence. So, 3 days after they start, send the first reminder, and then every week up until the deadline, send them reminders over and over again. We've seen that increases participation rates in reviewer by over 30%. And again, it's a very small thing, but these individuals, life happens, life gets busy. Depending on your current process and tools, they may have thought that they submitted, but in reality, they hadn't, right? And so it's all about peace of mind, letting them know, hey, we haven't yet received it yet. Come back in, make sure you resubmit. Or if they intended to come back over the weekend and they got busy and they forgot about your midnight deadline, now we can kind of get ahead of that earlier on. So again, it's not just an online form. There's a lot of built-in mechanisms to track them and guide them through the experience. That also becomes really important long term. And this isn't for today's conversation. This is session number 3. But let's just say your program is one of those that has the scholarship recipients who now need to come back and submit additional deliverables. And those additional deliverables now have their own timelines. It could be post-selection acceptance packets and thank you letters. Maybe 1 year from now, it's a renewable scholarship. Maybe 2 years from now, it's an impact report of how the scholarships changed their lives. And then you're going to use that data to kind of help build like a donor packet. You need to be able to not only collect that information from them at those different stages, which we will look at, but also be able to track them. So in 1 year from now, if you've got a scholar who now needs to do the renewal application, who's in that stage, have they done it or not, and not let's send them reminder messages as well. So I do want to inject and kind of incorporate the last bullet or the last conversation today, which is scholarship design. And so what we're basically looking at here from an application perspective is a multi-part form. And so I always challenge organizations to look at your current scholarship applications. And the first thing that we want to do is look at what data are we collecting, and let's start to shave out the things that are unnecessary. Again, we as humans have grown over time to just overcomplicate things. We're collecting things like social security numbers or parent tax documentation, and those might be valuable resources that you need at some point. But using a tool like Reviewer that's very profile centric, you can break these into stages. So if you're a very large organization, and this may not be relevant to everybody here today, and you've got like 2,000 people who apply, do we really need all 2,000 of them to submit their social security number, exposing both you and them to risk? Probably not. And so why don't we collect only the bare necessities that we need for that current stage of the program that we need for judging and scoring? And as they progress from one stage to the next, maybe they're in the last and final stage, which is an interview. Okay, maybe now we start to collect the tax documentation to verify their household income. Or maybe that's when we start to verify their social security numbers for background checks and things like that. So again, look at your overarching scholarship application. It really does need to align with the mission and vision of your organization. And then at the end of the day, go through every single line item and say, hey, do we need this for judging and scoring right now? If there's any thought or question around it being a no, remove it, right? We don't want to overcomplicate things. This also then lends itself to the next piece of the puzzle. So with a lot of the organizations that we work with, they either have multiple scholarships and or they have a lot of very clear specific eligibility requirements. So I'm going to merge topics 2 and 3 into kind of one quick introduction, and then I'm going to show this to you. So if you're one of the programs, or maybe you have to be from a certain location pursuing a certain career path, you have to have a certain GPA range, you have to come from a certain demographic or ethnicity. We don't want to just open these applications up to the broader public and say, hey, go spend a bunch of time applying. And then we're going to check eligibility later on, because 2 things happen. One is that we're wasting a bunch of your time vetting through all these applications just to see if they're a fit for your program. And then B, again, we wasted the applicants' time applying for opportunities that they're not eligible for. You then start to couple that with the required documentation, right? So if you have, file uploads like resumes or FAFSAs or letters of recommendation or transcripts, how do we ensure that we have a tool in place that makes them all required? Again, they may not need to do this at one time and in one sitting. They can come back, they can save, they can log out, they can return later. But when the applications get submitted, if it crosses that bridge and they're actually completed applications, how do we ensure that they really are complete? And you're not having to reach back out to them and say, hey, this is an unofficial transcript, not an official transcript, or you forgot your resume, or you didn't answer this question, right? We want to make sure that anybody who submits is A, eligible, and then B, has all the data that we need from them. That way there's not a bunch of going back and forth. The reason I want to couple this with the next topic, which is a matching tool, is many of the clients that we work with might offer multiple different scholarships. And that's a big challenge in the sense that every one of those scholarships may actually have its own unique criteria and eligibility. And what we don't want to see you do is have on your website 7 or 8 different links to 8 different scholarships, right? Because from an applicant's perspective, they now need to go to 8 different places to fill these forms out. They're redundantly entering the same information over and over again, and they're only answering the unique questions relevant to that scholarship. And then two is from a pure opportunity perspective, you might have very hyper specific scholarships with criteria that applicants are highly qualified for, but they just don't know exist. And so we see day in, day out that there's programming that goes underfunded or under applied for just because the applicants had no idea that it was even available for them or that they were a good fit for that. So how do we solve both of these challenges at one time? And that's kind of why I paused to show that to you. And so the entire concept of a reviewer in that profile is to build a comprehensive synopsis or a picture of who the scholars are. So in this example, and this is if I was to launch a scholarship right now, I would probably mimic this and then maybe scale back and remove some of the irrelevant things for your programming. But I want to focus on kind of three core things. I want to focus on academic achievements, and I also add into that, volunteer and community service. I want to focus on financial need, and I want to focus on personal storytelling, which I believe is the most critical aspect to this. That'd be your references and your essays. How do we give the applicants a voice to differentiate themselves from the peers in these competitive programs? So first and foremost, before we can go there, is that eligibility. So this is a very simple example, although it could be far more robust. But basically what we challenge you guys to do is look at your scholarship and or scholarships, and for each one of them, look at what are the eligibility criteria. And some of them can be very simple. So for example, we've got a client that I spoke to this morning in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. And so for them, all they care about is you're a graduating high school senior and you're from the Dallas area. Well, as we all know, that's a large demographic, right? And so how do you not have a bunch of people applying from Austin, right? Just because they see there's a Texas-based scholarship. Or maybe they just graduated, right? And now they're looking for scholarships 1 year out. Again, it seems like a small thing, but if there's 50 people that attempt to apply, we wasted their time. Plus now you as an admin have to vet through all 50 of them. We have a lot of clients in the school district space who have 101 scholarships. Each one of them is an endowed scholarship, and they have super hyper specific criteria, right? This donor wants applicants who played high school sports and who are going to be going to college in this certain region, right? So the entire premise here is we load into the system all the requirements, all the eligibility across all of your programming. And then we do two things. If they're not eligible, we can do one of two things. We can prevent them from proceeding so we don't waste their time, or you can put them into a holding pattern, let them still proceed on in a more basic form, and then use those for maybe like an opportunity to say, hey, we have this large demographic who attempted to apply. There's no fit for them now, but maybe we need to spin up a new scholarship to kind of target that demographic, right? So you're capturing data that you may find that is useful as your programs grow and scale. The second thing that we do is if you are offering multiple scholarships, we now convert this to a very guided experience. So instead of saying, hey, scholar, go fill out this extremely long, lengthy application form, which by the way, 2/3 of it won't be relevant to you, we start to target and say, okay, based off of your eligibility criteria of the 7 scholarships that we offer, these are the 3 that you actually are qualified for. Now, of those 3, which of them do you want to apply for? And then the system in real time would say, hey, because they chose the Brooke Marlowe scholarship and the Jasper Rice scholarship, we don't need to know who you are anymore because we already know who you are from your profile. What we really care about is in the Brooke Marlowe scholarship, is there a very unique essay? Or in the Jasper Rice scholarship, is there a certain upload that we need from them? So once they make their selection, they're now applying to potentially multiple scholarships in one sitting. And instead of redundantly submitting a bunch of information about themselves, they're only answering the questions relevant to that scholarship that they chose. And now, again, on the back end, you can have different dates and deadlines. You can categorize them. That's not part of today's conversation. But again, from a pure scholar perspective, we just did two very important things. We lowered the barrier for them to apply to multiple opportunities, and we made sure that they're aware of the opportunities that are available to them. So let's kind of jump back over. I believe the next thing that we're going to look at here are those references. And I try to, go through these conversations in about 30 to 35 minutes. But I do want to kind of, again, focus on scholarship design. So again, every organization we work with has unique application forms. That's totally fine. Again, we have some clients that only focus on financial need. They're academic based or financial based. Others are completely merit based, right? So they have a ton of essay prompts. They've got a ton of video essays and testimonials and references. That's fine. But for the vast majority of organizations, they can focus on the three things, right? Academic achievements, financial need, and then personal storytelling. And then if you wanted to, you could weight each one of those on a different scale. So if you care about financial need, but you care more about their essays and their references, you can weight that higher to put a stronger emphasis on that. But in this example, it's a really good use case of an applicant coming in and they may not be prepared yet to do their transcript. However, they do want to move on to their essays. And so that's why it's really important for them to be able to save, log out, come back later, and more importantly, have complete visibility on what's still required from them that they haven't submitted yet. But in this example, applicants are entering some basic information, test scores, transcripts. We'll reserve this for session number 2, which is the judging and scoring process. But this is also where I would highly recommend layering on some automations. And so if you're going to give like a scorecard, right, on academic achievements, don't make your review team look at their ACT scores or their GPA and give point values. Let the system do that automatically. So for example, like if you have a GPA of a 3.5 to a 4.0, you might get 3 points. If it's a 2.5 to a 3.0, you might get 2 points, just as an example. The system knows their GPA, knows their test scores. It can analyze that and actually allocate points automatically. That way, when your team who are volunteers comes in to judge and score it, we use them what they're intended for, right? Which is human judgment and elements like reading their essays. So we can kind of come back to that here in session number 2. This is also now where we're collecting financial need. What I really like about this client example that we're looking at here is not only are they basically saying like, what is your household income? What is your expenses? And they're asking to verify it with parent tax return documentation and FAFSA. They also ask a very important question that says, look, if you don't get a scholarship, how do you intend on paying for this, right? Because it's all about building that comprehensive picture of a scholar. You might have somebody who comes from a very high household income family, that quote unquote has a low financial need, but they're getting zero support. So they might be taking out 7% student loans or working through college. Or you might have somebody else who has maybe low financial need, but they have parent backing or they've already received scholarships from other organizations. And so again, it's like, how do we collect all the data that your team needs to make the best decisions? And then the third thing I want to look at, which is what I'm going to pause on here, is your personal storytelling. So I would say, again, upwards of 90% plus of the groups that we work with have some form of essay-based applications. I think it's the number one way to give your applicants a voice and help them differentiate themselves. Some of the challenges, obviously, is AI. We're finding a large number of applicants nowadays are using tools like ChatGPT to help assist with their content creation and write their essays for them. We are launching an AI detection tool, which might be valuable. One of the things that many of our clients have started to do, though, is they basically have gotten out of text-based essays and they do 3 to 5 minute videos. So it's almost like a virtual interview where they're answering the questions verbally, right, through a video format. The downside of that is that it could be higher barrier for them. The pro to that is I think it's harder to fake, right? So they're less likely to use AI. It's also far more engaging for the review team. They're reading less, they're watching more, but it also removes the ability to do data redaction. That's another kind of core piece that we'll get into in session 2. A lot of our clients are hiding name and demographic details to ensure a fair, non-biased judging process. When you put a face behind a camera and let them do a video, you start to lose some of that capability. So you could reserve that for a future stage if you want to. So let's kind of go back to today's topic. Again, I'm kind of merging a bunch of things into one to keep it flowing correctly. What I want to spend some time on, though, are references. And I am curious in chat if anybody wants to leave a comment or like leave an emoji of a thumbs up if you guys are doing letters of recommendation or references. Again, it's a very common workflow that we see across a lot of our clients. And traditionally speaking, references happen kind of one of 2 different ways. The applicants themselves, as they're applying for the scholarship, will upload their letters of recommendation. The downside of that is I've never seen a negative written letter. However, more times than not, it is a very private process, and the person writing the reference does not want the applicants to see it. So to combat that, a lot of organizations have the individual writing the reference send it to them directly. The pro to that, again, is it keeps it confidential and private. The downside of that is you start to lose visibility. So we've got no idea what references we're still waiting on. The applicant has no idea if the reference has done it or not. And then also from an operational perspective, you're now getting a bunch of random emails with a bunch of references attached, trying to figure out who does this belong to? How do I send it back to them? So that's one piece. The other piece of that is reference letters have kind of grown out of trend. They're very traditional. The downside to a reference letter is A, applicants write it about themselves. 2, it's easy to write with AI. And 3 is that they are a reflection of the writing ability of the reference, not who they're writing about. And so, for example, I love my wife to death. I'm a terrible writer. And so if I wrote a reference letter about her, she may be negatively penalized because of my poor writing ability, when in reality, it's not a reflection of her as a scholarship candidate. So how do we solve some of these things? We have a very powerful feature. And again, you can try to do these things without reviewer. Again, my goal isn't to demo this system for you. It's to kind of visualize these concepts in real time. What a lot of organizations nowadays are doing is they're basically forcing the hand and making these references get submitted directly by the reference themselves. But then in doing so, you have to solve the problem of both visibility and making it low barrier for the reference. So what most groups will do is in the application forms, they actually ask the applicant to specifically put in like the name and email of who is writing the reference. And they actually may require multiple references, right? You might have to have like a personal reference, but then also an academic reference. And then what happens is in real time, an email notification can be sent directly to the reference. Now, the key there is that notification has to come from you. You don't want it coming from like a generic email address. You don't want it coming from a software vendor like Reviewer, right? So it should come from your domain. It increases trust, email deliverability. The references have no idea who Reviewer is. They do know who maybe you are. But the beauty of this is the reference then simply clicks on the link that says, hey, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Michael. Click here, and then it brings them into a dedicated portal to submit that reference. Now, here's where kind of that trend starts to kick in. You can certainly still do a very traditional reference letter. That's totally fine. They can come in here, they can upload the letter, they can move on with their life, or you can kind of strip it out and then do a template. So like, what are 3 like almost mini essays that you want references to answer? Tell us more about their academics. Tell us a bit more about their leadership, right? So it mimics the concept of a letter, but it makes it more low barrier for them. And then more importantly is when you guys go to do review and selection, you're comparing apples to apples because every reference kind of talked about the same concepts that align with your mission. So when they go to score them, right, they're not comparing, one applicant whose reference talked about something completely irrelevant versus somebody else's. The beauty of this, though, is once the reference is done, it actually gets added automatically back to the applicant profile. That can brings full circle the importance of those profiles. And then also from a visibility perspective, going back to your command center, I mentioned early on that you can track stages and progress and send reminders. It's actually essential to do the same thing for those references. So it shows you how many references we're still waiting on. Shows us who they are, shows us how far they made it. You can send reminder messages to them automatically. You can send reminders to the applicant. Once the references get submitted, you can also notify the applicants, letting them know reference A is done, giving them peace of mind. And then also kind of part of a bigger concept is, more times than not, applicants will procrastinate, which means that they apply the night before your deadline, that reference was now given like 3 hours to write it. So either they're not going to do it or the quality of work goes down dramatically. So using this model, you can actually have different dates and deadlines. You can have, applications for a scholarship close at a certain day and time, but any requested scholarship references can have like an extra 1 week window. And then again, depending on how you structure this, we have some clients that say, hey, we require 2 letters of recommendation, but you can have, up to 4 or 5. You do not want applications coming in without those references. So it's really important to be able to flag every application as they're submitted, and then in real time look at the references to see if they're done or not. If not, it marks the application as in progress until those references get complete, and then the status changes of that scholarship application. So it's a pretty big shift in how references are collected. It's been widely successful for many reasons. It puts the work on the references. It allows the applicants to kind of continue on and work at their own pace on their own time. It brings more visibility to the process. You can ensure higher completion rates because of those reminder messages. And then from a judging perspective, which is next week, it ensures more compliance because there's way more consistency across how those references were collected. So the last piece of this puzzle, which I already kind of talked about, is scholarship design. So again, going back to my example here, and I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, break your scholarships into 3 key sections, and those sections will be different for every one of you. So it goes back to what I mentioned very early on of like redesigning your applications with 2 things in mind. What is the mission and vision of your organization to make sure that our applications align with it? Number 2, it's looking at what data do we need right now. Again, that doesn't mean we can't collect things from the applicants later on, but what do we need right now, and then not over collecting. And then number three is kind of weighting your application. So again, for me personally, I like a combination of both academics, financial, and personal storytelling, but I'm probably going to weight the personal storytelling higher than academic achievements, right? Because it's a better influence on who they are as a character and their personality. With all that said, I know we ran about 6 minutes late. Next week, May 6th at 2 is going to be the next session. We're going to dive really deep into review and selection. That is the session that we don't want to miss. There are so many moving parts to proper scholarship review. We're going to talk about some of the best practices around pairing up scholars with your team. How do we avoid things like volunteer fatigue? With some of the tools that we have in place. How do we normalize personal tendencies by your committee members? So for example, if I, as Kyle, am on average a tougher judge or scorer than somebody else, how do I not let that negatively impact them? We're going to look at some of those AI tools that can help expedite the review process, but not remove some of the human element. And then the following week on May 14th, we're going to talk about the post-scholar deliverables and workflows. But again, I think while, going into this, a lot of people think, oh, these are just scholarship applications. I've got that taken care of. Hopefully you walked away today with, two things. One is some type of tangible takeaway of how your scholarship applications are structured. It could be the references, it could be the eligibility, and then you can start to make some changes there. But also just really understanding that the scholarship application, how you collected that profile concept really does lay the groundwork for phases 2 and 3 that we'll kind of get into here in the coming weeks.